Have you ever wondered what happens when oppression reaches your maximum limit? When is pain so deep that it becomes something powerful and uncontrollable? Today I will share with you a story that few know, but reveals one of the most impactful cases of slave resistance in the cotton plantations of colonial Georgia. The story of Eleanor, a woman who kept her fury in silence until the unbearable happened. What you will find out in the coming minutes will change your understanding of how resistance manifested in the shadows of large plantations. It's not just another account of suffering, it's a revelation about how revenge can become an act of justice when all other paths are blocked. Follow this investigation to the end, as I will reveal details that have never reached the official history books. If you enjoy knowing the hidden side of our history, the one that is rarely told in the classrooms, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. What Eleanor did on that 1788 night caused tremors that spread throughout the coastal region of Georgia, and this story needs to be known. I prepared something unique for you today, with information I spent months researching almost forgotten files. What you will testify below is the account of how an ordinary woman has become a symbol of resistance that still whispers between the Spanish moss-covered trees in the Savannah lands. The cotton fields of the Willow Creek plantation still exist, now transformed into a historic park 30 kilometers from Savannah. The Spanish moss still hangs from the old trees as silent witnesses. There, under the shadow of the centenary oaks, the smell of the moist earth mixes with the salty aroma that comes from the river. The ruins of the old house still keep dark marks in the stone basements. Historians insist that they are just moisture stains, but locals know the truth. Those spots tell a history of blood and retribution. Every prolonged injustice eventually finds its answer, and to understand what really happened on the night of August 13, 1788, we need to recognize a fundamental truth. When you close all the doors to justice, someone will inevitably open a window for revenge. Eleanor, with his skilled hands and his keen mind, was not just a victim of a brutal system. She became the instrument of her own liberation and the liberation of many others. The story I'm going to tell today does not seek to glorify violence, but understanding how despair can turn into action when there is no other way out. In a society where justice was only for some, Eleanor created his own moral code. The scars on the back of Willow Creek slaves were the writing of a story of legitimized cruelty, while the body of the foreman Thomas Blackwood would become the scroll where Eleanor would write his answer. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Plantation Willow Creek extended for over 1,000 acres of fertile land on the banks of the Savannah River. The endless white cotton rows contrasted with the dark mud where men, women, and children worked bent from sunrise to sunset. The property belonged to the Harrington family for 3 generations, with the current patriarch, William Harrington, rarely present on the property, preferring Savannah's social life to plantation responsibilities. The big house rose over a small elevation, with its white columns and large balconies from which all the work could be observed in the fields. In the back of the property, the enslaved cabins formed a desolate semicircle, wooden rudimentary structures with precarious roofs that barely protected from rain. Each cabin housed up to 3 families in tight spaces without privacy. Willow Creek's sounds were marked by the rhythm of the hoes against the ground, by the crack of the whips cutting the air, by the muffled moans of those who endured the pain. The bell of the plantation controlled each movement, waking up at 4 in the morning, 15 minutes to the midday meal, continuing until darkness made it impossible to distinguish cotton from the earth. The tools of the control were everywhere. The punishment trunk in the center of the courtyard, the pillory in front of the instrument house, the chains and shackles hanging on the workshop walls where Thomas Blackwood the foreman planned his punishments. Blackwood's own whip was a nightmare object, with 9 leather straps reinforced with small pieces of metal at the ends, known among the enslaved as the draft, capable of removing pieces of meat with a single blow. The surveillance system was meticulous, the smaller patrol forever. The fields advanced during the day, while hunting dogs were loose at night to prevent escapes. Each enslaved had to present a specific amount of cotton harvested at the end of the day. Those who did not comply were punished the next morning before all, as an example. In the summer of 1788, the hot air made the work even more unbearable. Maduro cotton tore the workers' hands, while insects devoured any exposed piece of skin. That year, A drought had made the soil harder, making cultivation even more difficult. Punishments increased, food decreased, and an oppressive feeling hovered on Willow Creek, like the storm clouds that promised rain, but never delivered it. Eleanor was 20, 8 years in 1788. He was tall and a strong constitution, born and raised at the Willow Creek plantation. His mother had been the big house cook before he died of fever when Eleanor was only 12 years old. After his mother's death, Eleanor inherited not only his culinary skills, but also the knowledge of herbs and medicinal plants that grew up on the marshy banks of the river. His position as a cook gave him access to the big house and the outer kitchen, where he could hear the conversations of the whites. Eleanor memorized information, cataloged secrets, observed habits and weaknesses. When he served meals in the dining room, he became almost invisible to the Harrington and his guests, who spoke freely about business, politics, and even the plans to deal with problematic slaves. In the fields, Eleanor was respected. He distributed herbs to relieve pain, knowing fevers and infections, and often shared part of the leftovers of the big house with the needy. His cabin, although as simple as the others, had become a meeting point where resistance whispers were exchanged on moonless nights. What made Eleanor truly dangerous was his ability to transit between worlds. In the big house, it was the submissive and reliable cook. In the fields, he was the guardian of ancestral knowledge. On secret nights, it was the voice that kept alive the memory of Africa through past stories from generation to generation. She knew the customs of the Orishas brought by her grandmother, knew how to read a few words she had learned by listening to the lessons of the Harrington children, and understood the nature of the poisonous plants that grew in nearby swamps. Her younger sister, Abigail, just 17, had recently been transferred to work at Casa Grande as Mrs. Harrington's personal maid. Eleanor watched with increasing apprehension the eyes that Thomas Black would throw for his sister whenever he visited the main house. Leave in the comments, "Never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed." The horrors in Willow Creek followed a perverse logic of climbing. In the previous winter, a man named Moses had been whipped to death for allegedly planning an escape. His body was left hanging on the central tree for 3 days as a warning. In spring, a pregnant woman named Sarah lost her baby after being forced to work in the field under the scorching sun, even begging for water. In June, a 12-year-old boy had 3 fingers severed as a punishment for stealing leftover food from the kitchen. Eleanor witnessed each of these atrocities, feeling each blow as if it were in his own flesh. After each new horror, she would leave for a small hiding place that had created under the floor of her cabin, where she kept a small bottle containing a dark liquid extracted from plants that only she could identify. With each new cruelty, he added a few more drops as if distilling his own anger. When John, an old man who had taught Eleanor to recognize the stars, was beaten for falling asleep during work, she spent the whole night holding her hand as he fought to breathe with his lungs full of blood. When he finally passed away before dawn, something inside her broke and turned. Her look, once low in the presence of whites, was now burning with a controlled fire she carefully hidden. Harrington were cruel for neglect and distance, but Thomas Blackwood found active pleasure in brutality. The 40-year-old foreman had developed his own methods of torture, how to make slaves on his knees over corn grains while holding heavy extended logs, or using salt water on the wounds opened by the whips. His cruelty was calculated to maximize pain without causing immediate death, ensuring that the investment was not lost. In July 1788, when the heat made the air almost breathable, Eleanor noticed the changes in his sister Abigail's behavior. The young woman, once lively and smiling even in the worst circumstances, had become Ida is scared. He avoided looking straight at anyone and trembled visibly when Blackwood appeared in the big house. For 3 nights in a row, Eleanor met his sister crying quietly in his corner of the cabin who shared with 2 other families. On the 4th night, Abigail finally told the truth. Blackwood had forced her repeatedly when Mrs. Harrington was absent from the house. He had threatened her to sell her to Louisiana's swamps if she told someone or resisted. Eleanor hugged his sister, his fingers caressing the young woman's hair as her heart turned pain into determination. That night Eleanor didn't cry. She planned. The worst was yet to come. On August 10, 1788, during a cotton field inspection, Blackwood accused Abigail, who had been temporarily assigned to work on the harvest, due to Mrs. Harrington's absence of hiding cotton in her clothes so as not to reach the daily quota. Despite the young woman's protests, he dragged her to the center of the field and ordered everyone to stop to watch the example. Eleanor was just 20 steps away when he saw the 9-pointed whip cut the air and hit his sister's face. Abigail's scream cut the silence of the fields like a lightning ripped the sky. A second whip crossed his face again, this time opening a deep cut from his right eye to his chin. Blood spoiled as Abigail fell to his knees, his hands trying to protect what was left from his face. "This is what happens with thieves," shouted Blackwood, raising the whip again. It was at this moment that something definitive changed in Eleanor. She observed the scene no more horror, but with cold and crystalline clarity. Her body trembled not fear, but of an irreversible decision that made form inside. While the other enslaved eyes lowered their eyes, unable to witness more horror, Eleanor kept his fixed, memorizing every detail, every movement, every expression on Blackwood's face. That night, cleaning Abigail's wounds, Eleanor whispered promises in his ear. No promises of escape or better days, but something deeper and more definitive. While applying cataplasms to the open wounds that permanently disfigured his sister's face, Eleanor took a silent oath sealed with the blood of Abigail that's staining his hands. The cruelty in Willow Creek was not the work of a single man. William Harrington, the absent owner, created the system that allowed abuse. His wife, Elizabeth Harrington, pretended not to see the bruises on the house's slaves. The local reverend justified slavery in his Sunday sermons. Savannah's merchants profited with the blood-stained cotton. The neighbors of plantations owned discipline techniques during their refined dinners. Thomas Blackwood, however, was the closest and tangible face of this system. Born in a poor Ireland family, he had risen to the foreman position through his willingness to do the dirty work that others avoided. Its specialty was to break the spirit of newly arrived enslaved and identify possible leaders to be disciplined before they could organize any resistance. But the system also had its own internal tensions. Young James Harrington, son of William, newly ruled in study in Europe, had begun to question the practices of the plantation, influenced by abolitionist ideas he had found abroad. The smaller foremen, many of them poor whites, envied Blackwood's privileged position. Mrs. Harrington himself secretly despised Blackwood, considering him a necessary brute but unworthy of social respect. On August 12th, a day after the attack that disfigured Abigail, a colonial government inspector arrived in Willow Creek to evaluate production and taxes due. James Harrington, trying to impress the inspector with progressive ideas, suggested in front of everyone during dinner that perhaps corporal punishment could be reduced in favor of other control methods. Blackwood, feeling his authority threatened, vehemently argued against, describing the enslaved as animals that only understand the language of the whip. Eleanor, serving the meal, heard the whole conversation. When Blackwood proclaimed that, "Tomorrow, I will give a demonstration of how to deal with indolence," referring to a planned collective punishment, she knew that the moment had come. The final catalyst was put in motion that night when Eleanor heard Blackwood, drunk after the meal, boasting to the other forever on how the black man had marked so that no one else would want her. Those words, between whiskey's laughs and sips, sealed the destination of the foreman. Eleanor, hidden in the shadows of the outer kitchen, felt time stopping around his hands that held a flag already dessert. The moment of the decision had arrived, and there was no return possible. On August 13th, 1788, Thomas Blackwood ordered all enslaved to meet at the center of the plantation after work. The sun was set, throwing long shadows over the dirt courtyard where the punishment trunk had been erected. Eleanor and 5 other slaves were selected as examples because they supposedly did not reach their harvest quotas. In front of almost 100 people, Blackwood announced that each would receive 20 whip, starting with Eleanor. "This one thinks that being a cook makes her better than the others," he proclaimed, pulling the top of his clothes. "Today, everyone will see that none of you are above the discipline." The first blow cut Eleanor's back, but she didn't shout it. The second opened a deep wound, and yet it remained silent. In the third blow, his knees gave way, but his eyes remained open, fixed to a distant point, as if his spirit were already elsewhere. When the punishment ended, Eleanor could barely stand. his back turned into a bloody screen of deep cuts. The other 5 received a similar punishment, including an elderly man who passed out after the 10th blow and was revived with a bucket of water so that he could feel the rest of the punishment. In the end, Blackwood ordered Eleanor to cleanse the whip's blood before keeping it, a final act of humiliation. That night, in the darkness of the cabin, while Abigail applied ointments to the open wounds of his back, Eleanor spoke for the first time since the punishment. His voice contained no pain or fear, just absolute clarity. He will not see the next sunrise. The decision was made, the complete transformation. The submissive cook had died in that trunk of punishment, and something new had been born in the open wounds of his back. Something patient, methodical, and relentless. In the weeks prior to the incident with Abigail, Eleanor had already begun subtle preparations, as if a part of her knew that the inevitable moment was approaching. In her rare free hours, she had mentally mapped every corner of the Willow Creek property, the times of the guards' rounds, the big house routines, the Blackwood night habits. After public punishment, Eleanor secretly met with 3 trusted people. Isaiah, a blacksmith whose brother had been killed by Blackwood the year before. Martha, a midwife who knew the same medicinal and poisonous plants as Eleanor. And Samuel, a young man who worked in the stables and had access to tools and the Harrington family travel calendar. The plan was divided into accurate phases. Isaiah would create a distraction at the other end of the property, burning a small storage shed for rarely used. Martha would prepare a mixture of herbs to be added to the food of guard dogs, not to kill them, but to induce them to deep sleep for a few hours. Samuel would guarantee that horses would be prepared for a quick escape if necessary. Eleanor has established a sign code using lanterns positioned on specific windows to coordinate the movements. The chosen moment was not random. She knew, through the conversations she had heard at Casa Grande, that William Harrington and his wife would be in Savannah that night to an important ball, and that James Harrington planned to accompany them. The plantation would be under the exclusive command of Blackwood. The poison Eleanor was gradually distilling would be applied in 2 phases. A smaller dose would be mixed with whiskey that Blackwood drank every night, not to kill him, but to make it and confuse his senses. The second phase would be more direct and definitive, involving a knife Eleanor had hidden under the floor of her cabin. A butcher knife she had patiently sharp for weeks. The plan earned a name among the few who knew its details. Blackwood's Harvest, a dark reference to the cotton that it forced all the spoon day after day. The date was set for the night following the public punishment, August 14th, 1788, a Thursday. A silent countdown began among the conspirators, each knowing that there was no possibility of retreat. Tomorrow night, when the supper bell sounds, our true freedom will begin to be born. Eleanor whispered to Martha as they exchanged medicinal herbs to treat their wounds still open. The pact was sealed, the duties distributed, and Thomas Blackwood's fate, although he didn't know it yet, was already decided. The night of August 14th, 1788 was divided into 2 parallel worlds coexisting in the Willow Creek plantation. In the big house, the Blackwood subordinate forensics celebrated the absence of the Harrington with letters, drinks, and high laughs. Blackwood himself, sitting at the headboard from the table, he emptied glass after whiskey glass, his voice becoming higher and his most grotesque stories every round. In the cabanas of the enslaved, a tense silence predominated. Looks were exchanged, small nods with his head communicated messages understood only by those involved. Children were placed to sleep early, with firm instructions not to leave their treadmills under any circumstances. Twilight brought with it a damp and suffocating heat, typical of August in Georgia. The night's night sounds, frogs, insects, and the occasional roar far from an alligator, created a primitive symphony that seemed to announce that something old and relentless had awakened in Willow Creek's lands. In the outer kitchen, Eleanor has prepared with meticulous caution for dinner for Blackwood and the other forefront. In a moment of loneliness, he withdrew from his clothes a small bottle containing a dark, viscous liquid, a mixture of mandrake, trumpet flowers, and other plants that only she could identify. With accurate movements, he added a few drops to the whiskey barrel, while whispering words in a language his grandmother had taught him. As the night advanced, the noise in the big house became more disordered. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor could see Blackwood stamping, his red and sweaty face, his movements increasingly uncoordinated. When the living room clock hit 11 o'clock, she made the combined signal. 3 fast beaten straight by 2 slow down. In the distance at the other end of the property, a small construction of wood erupted on sudden flames. The screams of fire, they echoed the property, and the least drunk forensics ran toward the fire, leaving Blackwood alone in the dining room, unable to get up from his chair due to combined effects of alcohol and poison. The guard dogs, which would usually have barked frantically in the face of the commotion, remained strangely silent, sleeping deeply after eating the meat prepared especially for Martha hours earlier. Eleanor waited 10 more minutes, counting every second in his mind. Time seemed to drag itself, every beat of his heart sounding like the bell of the plantation in his ears. When he finally moved, it was as if another being inhabited his body. His movements were fluid, precise, almost feline in his mortal grace. The scene was ready, the positioned actors, and the final act of this terrible tragedy about to begin. Thomas Blackwood, drunk and debilitated by the poison, was barely able to record when Eleanor silently entered the dining room. His injected eyes tried to focus on the approaching figure, but his confusing mind did not understand the danger. "You bring more whiskey," he babbled, trying to get up and falling back in his chair. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," said Eleanor, his strangely calm voice as he approached a tray. Only when it was a few steps away, the foreman noted that the tray did not contain a bottle, but a long knife of butcher, the same as Eleanor used to cut the meat in the kitchen of the big house. The first blow was quick and accurate, reaching Blackwood's right hand, the same one that held the whip daily. Before he could scream, Eleanor covered his mouth with a cloth soaked in more of his paralyzing poison. The foreman's eyes widened in shock and terror when he understood what was happening. "This is by the hand that held the whip," Eleanor whispered, his voice without emotion, as if reciting a recipe. The second blow separated 3 fingers of the left hand. "These are by the fingers that drew from the boy who was only hungry." With a force that surprised Blackwood himself, Eleanor dragged him from the chair to the floor. The poison in his system prevented him from fighting effectively, although he tried to defend himself. Each cut she made was accompanied by a calm explanation, connecting the wound to a specific atrocity he had committed. "This is the eye of Abigail," she said, making a precise cut that opened a butcher from her right eye to Blackwood's chin, mirroring exactly the scar that her sister would carry forever. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic in its accuracy. Eleanor worked in silence except for the brief pronouncements that accompanied each blow. There was no visible anger on his face, just an intense concentration, as if he was doing a long, planned task. At the opposite end of the property, the fire had been contained, but had created enough confusion to keep the other forever busy. The few slaves who knew the plan ensured that no one approached the big house, spreading rumors that Blackwood had ordered not to be bothered. When he finished, Eleanor looked at the body embrayed before her. The polished wooden floor of the dining room, where so many times she had served downstream meals, was now covered with the blood of the man who had terrified Willow Creek for years. Her hands and clothes were soaked red, but her eyes remained clear and firm. She got up, walked calmly to the kitchen, and washed her hands in a basin. Then he took a small lamp and returned to the dining room. Without hesitation, she spilled lamp oil over her body and nearby furniture. With a single movement, he lit a match and dropped him. The flames rose quickly, consuming evidence and purifying the sight of horror. Eleanor noted for a few moments, his face illuminated by the growing fire before walking calmly out of the big house. Outside, the conspirators were waiting for her. Without words, they understood Eleanor's gaze that the work was completed. The big house was beginning to burn, the flames visible through the ground floor windows. Soon shouts of fire echoed again for the property, this time with genuine urgency. In the followed confusion, no one noticed when Eleanor, Abigail, Martha, Isaiah, Samuel, and the 15 slaves disappeared in the darkness of the night. The fire in the big house created a perfect distraction, consuming not only the physical structure, but also the evidence of what really happened in that dining room. Before they departed, Eleanor performed one last act. In the back of the outer kitchen, he carefully arranged the herbs and plants he had collected over the years. In the center, he placed the 9-tight whip of blackwood, which he had recovered from his office. With a deliberate movement, he set fire to this small altar, observing the flames to consume the instruments of their knowledge and the torment they had suffered. While the group walked away, a column of black smoke climbed from the Willow Creek plantation, visible by miles around. Those who looked from afar would only see an accidental fire in a colonial house. But for the 17 who walked rapidly toward the swamps, it was the funeral of a life of servitude and the birth of something new. Willow Creek's last image was the big house silhouette on fire against the night sky, with sparks rising like liberated souls, while a soft southern wind seemed to whisper promises of freedom on the leaves of the old trees. The news of the fire in the plantation Willow Creek spread quickly through the county's neighbors. The initial official reports described the event as a tragic accident, the result of negligence and excess drinking by the forecasts during the absence of owners. William Harrington, upon returning from Savannah and finding his ruined home and his main dead foreman, required a complete investigation. When Thomas Blackwood's charred remains were finally examined by a Savannah doctor, the true nature of his death became evident. Methodical cuts, deliberate mutilation, and systematic removal of specific parts of the body could not be attributed to a simple fire. The doctor, in his confidential letter to the governor of Georgia, described the corpse as subject to deliberate and calculated dissection, performed with precise anatomical knowledge, before being exposed to fire. Local authorities quickly connected the murder to the disappearance of 17 slaves from the property. Chatham County's sheriff letter to neighboring authorities warned a new and terrible slave rebellion method involving the use of poisons, anatomical knowledge, and purifying fire. The message described in detail the mutilations found in the body, specifically how each wound seemed to mirror punishments previously inflicted by the foreman. In less than 2 weeks, reports of similar incidents began to emerge in neighboring plantations. In Liberty County, a foreman known for his brutality was found dead in similar circumstances, with precise cuts and a subsequent fire. Near Brunswick, a slave owner completely disappeared, only his whip being found carefully willingly on his empty bed. The letters exchanged between plantations owners revealed increasing panic. "This is not a simple act of desperate violence, but a calculated method of terror," one of them wrote. "Blacks are using our own methods of fear against us." Another owner observed with alarm that, unlike previous rebellions, it seems to spread not by direct contact, but as an idea, a whisper that travels through the wind. The colonial authorities, fearing a widespread rebellion, sent militias to patrol the roads between plantations and increased the restrictions of movement to all enslaved. New statutes were quickly approved, prohibiting that slaves had access to herbs and plants without direct supervision, and requiring all food preparation to be observed by white people. Among the slave owners, the murder of Blackwood earned a name that would be whispered with fear for decades. The Eleanor method, a reference to the missing cook that quickly became a legendary figure. For the enslaved, however, events in Willow Creek represented something different. Not just fear, but a dangerous and forbidden hope. The response of Georgia's colonial authorities was rapid and brutal. The governor authorized the formation of special patrols, led by experienced slave hunters and equipped with trained dogs. These units, known as regulators, were authorized to enter any property where they suspected that fugitive slaves could be hidden. The first concrete track of the whereabouts of Eleanor's group came 3 weeks after the fire. A fisherman reported having seen unknown blacks moving through the coastal swamps near the Florida border, then Spanish territory. The patrols immediately converged to the region, establishing a perimeter that stretched through 40 miles along the coast. The regulators' strategy was methodical, dividing the area into sectors, draining parts of the swamps when possible, and using local guides that knew the rare high paths through the treacherous terrain. They offered substantial rewards for any information, and in October 1788 they achieved their first success when they captured Samuel, the stable youth, trying to get supplies in a small settlement. Samuel resisted the interrogation for 3 days, supporting torture that left permanent scars on his body. On the 4th day, either by exhaustion or deliberate strategy, he offered information about an alleged depths of the Okefenokee swamp. What the regulators didn't realize was that Samuel was guiding them away from the group's true location, gaining precious time for others. While the patrols went to the south following the false track, Eleanor and the others were already moving west, towards the territory of Creek, a Native American nation that occasionally offered refuge to runaway slaves. Eleanor's knowledge of wild plants allowed the group to survive with minimal resources, while their understanding of natural medicine treated the diseases that inevitably arose during the journey through malaria-infested swamps. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. In December 1788, a trader who negotiated with the Creek recognized Abigail for the distinctive scar on his face. Attracted by the substantial reward, he informed the colonial authorities about the group's approximate location. On January 7, 1789, a force of almost 50 men surrounded the small camp where Eleanor and the others had found temporary refuge. What followed was later described by one of the regulators as, not a capture, but a battle. Alerted by sentinels that had strategically positioned, Eleanor and his group were prepared. Using makeshift weapons and superior knowledge of the terrain, they resisted almost 2 hours before the numerical superiority and armament of the persecutors began to prevail. Isaiah was the first to fall, hit by multiple shots while protecting the removal of a group of women. Martha, the midwife, was captured alive, but not before severely hurting 2 of the regulators with a mixture of poisonous plants that had prepared for such eventuality. One by one, the group members were killed or captured, fighting to the end. Eleanor, Abigail, and 3 others managed to break the siege and flee into the depths of the forest. Relentlessly persecuted for days, the small group was finally trapped on the banks of an unblemished river. With their backs facing deep and fast water, they faced their persecutors in a last desperate confrontation. The versions of Eleanor's final destination vary according to the source. The official report sent to the governor simply stated that all fugitives were neutralized, some by firearms, others drowned when they tried to escape the river. The bodies, the document said, were properly arranged to prevent the objects of veneration from becoming. However, the oral reports that circulated among the enslaved told a different story. According to these narratives, when Eleanor realized that the capture was inevitable, he gathered his last companions in a circle. His final words, preserved through generations of whispered testimonies, were, "They can take our bodies, but what we have done is already beyond their reach. The method is in the wind now." Then, according to ESSS reports, Eleanor led a frontal attack on regulators, not with the intention of victory, but to create a distraction that would allow Abigail to escape. Wounded by multiple shots, Eleanor would have been deliberately walking toward his persecutors, reciting words in his ancestral language before finally succumbing. Eleanor's body has never been officially identified among the dead. Abigail was never found. In the following decades, Eleanor's name rarely appeared in official documents, except as a brief reference in reporting reports on plantations or as an example of the dangers of allowing enslaved to have access to specific knowledge. For formal historical records, it was little more than a footnote, a criminal whose actions justified greater control over the enslaved population. In enslaved communities, however, the story took a very different course. Eleanor's narrative has become a set of whispered stories in the huts at night, transmitted from mother to daughter, from father to son. The Eleanor method has become a coded expression for the possible resistance even in more oppressive systems. Objects associated with their history have acquired special meanings. A kitchen knife placed in a way could be a symbol of solidarity or warning. Certain herb combinations in a small bag became protective amulets. Songs apparently innocent about the cook who knew more than they showed contained coded messages about resistance and perseverance. Some reports suggest that Abigail survived and eventually arrived in the Spanish Florida, where he would have established a small community of healers who preserved Eleanor's knowledge of medicinal plants. Others claim that she secretly returned to Georgia years later, unrecognizable except for the characteristic scar, to continue the resistance work started by her sister. 19th century official historians, predominantly white and sympathetic to slave owners, mentioned Eleanor only as an example of the potential for wild violence among the enslaved. On the other hand, the first black historians after emancipation began to recover their history as an example of strategic resistance against systematic oppression. Archaeological excavations performed at the former Willow Creek plantation in the early 20th century discovered, under the ruins of the outer kitchen, a small sealed space containing glass vials, preserved seeds, and a partially burned diary written in a code combined African symbols and botanical designs. Although it has never been definitely proven, many believe this was Eleanor's knowledge book, deliberately hidden before his escape. To this day, in the rural communities of the coastal Georgia, stories persist about a herbal lady that appears to help the needy and disappears before dawn. They say she carries a small, sharp knife and that her face is marked by a scar that goes down from the eye to the chin. Discreet pilgrimages are still made to the ruins of Willow Creek, where visitors leave small arrangements of herbs or nodes with specific meanings. Academically, Eleanor remains a controversial figure. For some historians, it represents a justifiable response to the systemic violence of slavery. For others, their method of resistance raises complex questions about the cycles of violence and retribution. What cannot be denied, however, is the lasting impact of its actions on the collective memory of a community. In 2018, a previously unknown document was discovered in Georgia's state archives, a letter written by James Harrington, the owner's son, shortly before his death in 1840. In it, he confesses to secretly helped in Abigail's escape after Eleanor's death, motivated by remorse for what he witnessed in his family's plantation. The letter ends with an observation that may better capture Eleanor's lasting legacy. What haunts me most is not the violence of that night, but the clarity of purpose. It has transformed its suffering not into madness, but method. And methods, unlike people, cannot be killed. Eleanor's story continues to resurface in different forms, in poems, songs, plays, and more recently, in academic studies on female resistance during slavery. Each new generation finds something relevant in its narrative. The refusal to accept dehumanization, the transformation of knowledge into power, the fierce protection of those who loved. In the words of a popular corner that can still be heard in some rural churches of Georgia, "The cook knew the spice that released torment souls. Her method lives in the wind, and her name in our lament." If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Enjoy this video if the story of Eleanor has touched your heart. Share so that Eleanor's memory will never be forgotten.